Good afternoon. It's Father Jonathan coming to you for our reflection on this Good Friday, this second holy day of the Easter Triduum, the Passion of the Lord. And if we were at the Good Friday service, we'd have just heard the Passion from the Gospel of John, where the lector would come up, the deacon has his part, the priest has his part, and the congregation responds, and as we sort of act out the Passion, and it's all so powerful and it's all so tragic. That we're not experiencing this in communion. And then the priest is supposed to come down after this passion is acted out, and somehow he is supposed to give a homily that sort of enlightens the congregation on what was just read. And it's almost arrogant to think that we could actually do that, because the passion is such an unbelievable story that almost should just leave us sitting in silence. But nonetheless, we're called to do so. And in these times, I'm going to try my best to give some sort of reflection to help create a context for your own personal reflection on Good Friday. And the first thing I'd simply like to state is this, that I learned this when I was in seminary, and I used to return home, and I was trying to be the model seminarian and go about Good Friday and all my piety and holiness, even though it was all a big facade, I realize in hindsight. And I always try to make Good Friday something. And I learned over the years, and I'm still learning, that I can never really impose any meaning on Good Friday. I can read about it, read all the books, all the literature, all that stuff. And all that's important because it informs the experience. But sometime on Good Friday, I just simply have to appear before the cross and enter into the mystery of what it means that God has died for us. And just that statement that God has died for us, how powerful that is for us as Christians. And so what I'm simply going to try to do is create a context here using John's Gospel and our current times, because we always have to understand the Gospel not just in its original intent, but in light of our current times, to hopefully set a framework so that you can help you appreciate and enter into this Good Friday and how significant it is that we crucified God and what that means for us. So first of all, in the context of John's Gospel, and sorry for the long setup, I'd like to go back to the beginning, though, briefly, if I could, to John's Gospel, to John, I think it's 1:14. We have this very powerful statement that the Word became flesh and made its dwelling among us, which I think is maybe the sort of theological hinge for what it means to be Christian, because we're a very incarnational faith. We experience this at Christmas, but the reality of the incarnation is an infinite reality, and it's who we are. We're a faith that believes that our God took on flesh. And so we start with the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And then within that same chapter, just a handful of verses later, we have John the Baptist pointing Jesus out, the precursor, the last of the prophets, pointing this man out and saying, "Behold the Lamb of God." And obviously a foreshadowing of the crucifixion according to the author of John. And while I don't have any proof for this, I can't imagine that somewhere in the minds of the soon-to-be disciples, they were thinking, well, why are we following a lamb, especially knowing and maybe even rehearing, for lack of a better term, the shrieks of the lambs as they're slaughtered in the temple the night before Passover. A very mysterious sort of statement, and they follow, of course, nonetheless. And then in John 3:16, probably the most well-known Bible verse in modern times, that God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, which could also be translated, "For God so loved the world in this way, that he gave his only begotten Son." In other words, that God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. He gave his self to be crucified on our behalf for our eternal salvation. And I bring all that up because all of a sudden, and I would never preach this on Christmas, all of a sudden there's not as much space between the incarnation and the cross. All of a sudden that chasm is sort of filled, and they're not just bookends of the gospel, but it has to do with the mission of who God is. And we come to the realization that even as early as the incarnation, even in the nativity of Jesus Christ, the cross lingered all along. And they've been so intimately intertwined throughout the life of Jesus Christ that we can't just separate them and make them bookends of the gospel, but we have to see them in some way as the entire mission of who God is. And so the innocent baby exposed to the world and completely vulnerable in the manger becomes a man who's beaten within an inch of his life, vulnerable, exposed, and on the brink of despair as he goes to the cross. And then together we say, with trembling in our hearts and in our minds, and has our brains short-circuit in this way, because we can't say these statements without some sort of a shuddering experience that God is in the manger and then God is in the cross, and we have this image of this God who will go to infinite means to enter into our lives. And I think this is the great reality of Good Friday. The spotless victim becomes the lamb who prepares to be crucified and goes to the razor's edge, as I said before, of his own self-forgetfulness as he cries out from the cross, my God, why have you abandoned me?" And this God who enters so deeply into our own tragedy becomes more and more real and more apparent as we approach the cross. And maybe, just maybe, this time allows us an appreciation of the cross that many of us have never had before. Because if this pandemic, and we have to preach this in the context of our times, if this pandemic has left you with a feeling of powerlessness and a human capacity, well, you're in good company on this Good Friday. If this pandemic has left you exposed in a way that you could never imagine, well, you're in good company on this Good Friday. If this pandemic has left you vulnerable in a way you could never imagine, well, you're in good company on this Good Friday, as God reveals over and over again from the manger to the cross that power in Christ is always a power in weakness and frailty. It's a power that exists in the margins, and it's a power that exists in humanity. The cross and the manger destroys any human notion of power as we understand it, and it brings it crumbling to the ground. The cross insists that there's power in human struggling. It insists that there's power in human suffering, and it insists that there's power in human vulnerability, even to the point of exhaustion. And if you don't believe me, ask Christ himself, who became so vulnerable that he exhausted himself in the Garden of Gethsemane. And yet we miss this over and over and over again. The power of Christ, the power of the cross, where which God claims his reign, has nothing to do with human power as we understand it. And now maybe, just maybe, if there's anything good that can come out of this crisis, and I pray to God that we come out of it soon, just like you and I do, that we finally acknowledge our human frailty, that we acknowledge our human vulnerability, and we realize that God works in and through that. And there's this great power when we offer that up, because that's precisely what the cross exemplifies. God enters into the tragedy, the hell, and the chaos of our lives, and he insists on redeeming us over and over and over again. And so if this pandemic has given you this sense of loss of control and powerlessness and vulnerability, as I said before, you're in good company on this Good Friday as we approach the crucified one and realize how tragic it is that he had to be crucified, but how glad we are that he was willing to do that on our behalf. We will get to Easter Sunday. This Easter Sunday will not be like any Easter Sunday we've had in the past, and we may even be robbed of some joy, although I still hope we experience the resurrection, but robbed of some joy because we can't gather together as parish in this church. And maybe there'll be an Easter experience when we return in later weeks. But make no mistake about it, there are resurrections to come before the final resurrection, but we're not allowed to go there yet. So take the time this Friday, approach the cross, allow it to leave you trembling, maybe even bring you to your knees, and then finally may we begin to get a glimpse of what it really means to be Christian, to be like Christ, to be exposed in such a way that all we can offer is our own human frailty, and then to see that as an opportunity to exude great love. Because finally, on the cross, if we realize nothing else, and this is why it's called Good Friday, God received the insult, hatred, malice, and evil of the world, and all he could do was return good and forgiveness. And so as we carry our own cross this Good Friday, may it strip away all our evil, malice, deceit, anger, frustration, anxiety, and fear, so we can come before God completely exposed, longing on the other side of this to return the same love that he's given to us on the cross. Approach the cross this Good Friday in fear and trembling. Allow it to transform you and go out into your lives knowing the power of your own vulnerability and frailty. When we do this, we'll all realize again what it truly means to be Christian.